There was a seismic shift that happened in gospel music right around the early 90s that not many people seem to acknowledge. Unless you grew up with the music, you may not even be aware of it. For several decades, mass choirs had held a singular place in gospel music. Directors like Thomas A. Dorsey, James Cleveland, Dr. Mattie Moss Clark, Milton Brunson, and Thomas Whitfield had helped to define the sound of gospel. And legendary choirs like Georgia Mass, Mississippi Mass, and Walter Hawkins' Love Center Choir were responsible for many of the songs that we consider to be staples in gospel music today. But by the late 80s, the gospel choir had come to be associated with a sort of traditionalism that was regarded by many to be out of step with the times. But very soon, a handful of artists would succeed in rejuvenating ensemble-based gospel music by reintroducing the configuration that had helped to redefine the genre a generation before. And that charge would be led by an unlikely general, a man whose recent past as a drug dealer and user and a strip club owner would make him an ideal bridge between the church and the world that he had been called to reach. I'm Doris Starr Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. John Prince Key was born the 15th of 16 children in the early 1960s in Durham, North Carolina. He came from a very musical family. Both his parents were singers and musicians. His father actually had a record deal at one point. So music came naturally to John. He and his brothers and sisters all vied for their father's attention, and he finally figured out that if he could accompany his father on piano, he'd stand out. So he started working out a few chords to play underneath his father while he sang. He says his mother wanted him to take piano lessons, but he really didn't have any interest.
His mama said you had to go to piano class. I wanted to play football, and so I would forge her name, keep the $5, go to football practice, but I had to make up a song. So when I got home, Mom said, "What did you learn?" So I had to create melodies, man, and listen to the lesson up under the window. And then I was able to play it by ear.
He ended up graduating from North Carolina School of the Arts at 14 years old. By then, his father had had a stroke, and John didn't quite know how to deal with it, so he was looking for a way out. Two of his older brothers moved to California to pursue music, so he decided to go too. One of his first gigs at 14 years old was with Peter Frampton, which allowed him to relocate from North Carolina to the West Coast. While he was in California, he attended Marysville School of the Arts, which opened the door for him to start accompanying artists like Phyllis Hyman, Donald Byrd, and Grover Washington. For a while, his brothers had let him perform in the group that they started, but eventually they told him there just wasn't room for him. He needed to prove his usefulness to them, so he figured that the best way to do that was to learn to sing. He started obsessively listening to Stevie Wonder and a group named Ace Spectrum and imitating their vocal styles. Not much came from his brother's group, though, and John had started to fall prey to substance abuse. He was finally able to land a job playing with the funk band Cameo and used a tour with them as an opportunity to relocate back to North Carolina. When he got back to North Carolina, he was asked to be the musical director for several black beauty pageants. The work paid pretty well. He was able to buy a house, and he was doing all right for himself until the pageant work dried up. He eventually hit rock bottom, and he decided that selling weed would be the most lucrative way for him to make money. So he camped out in front of a local grocery store, and he did just that. Eventually, he moved on to heavier substances, and he soon found himself addicted as well. He tells some pretty wild stories about his supply being funneled through a local funeral home. Drugs would be stashed inside caskets, and he'd make deals with the undertakers to give them a cut of the profits. He had a pretty solid racket going. He was making out-of-town trips to places like Chicago and DC to buy and sell his supply. He even opened up a strip club at one point. He lived like this for close to 3 years until reality came crashing down around him.
It was a young man who got killed for $40, and I witnessed that.
And I knew then I had to change my lifestyle. I was so scared the night he got shot. I saw who shot him. I knew who killed him. And they saw me see them. And I told God, I said, if you get me back to Arden Street, that's where I lived in the hood, give me Arden Street, I'll give you my heart. I'll give you my life.
He says this time in his life fostered his compassion for the rejects of society, the unhoused, runaways, drug addicts, sex workers, and very soon he would get the chance to minister to the very people that he had befriended and exploited. It was at this time that he began to reconnect with the music that he loved. Through the connections that he had made during his time working at Maryville and working the clubs in California, he began to secure songwriting gigs. He wrote for some pretty big names in gospel at the time: Vanessa Bell Armstrong, Daryl Coley, James Cleveland, but one writing job in particular for one of the pioneers of contemporary gospel would lead to his big break as a singer and performer.
I wasn't supposed to sing the song. I carry a leader with me, the guy that I carried from Charlotte. He's a little dope head on the side, but I didn't think he was going to get high the day we were supposed to sing. He can't be found, and we're in Houston, so I had to sing this song. I started doing all these acrobatic things with my vocals. Me, and the people were loving it. I was like, what? It's working. Because at that time, if your song didn't make the record, you didn't get paid.
So a guy who had been working with Anita Baker heard him on the Edwin Hawkins album and recommended him to Leonard Scott of Tascott Records in Indianapolis. He started making albums and doing live performances wherever he could. This was the late 80s, and John P. Key wasn't super well known at the time, but he was starting to develop a pretty strong local following in North Carolina. He was invited by televangelist Jim Baker, who had a Christian resort and theme park called Heritage USA in Fort Mill, South Carolina, to be one of their regular performers at their outdoor attraction called Buffalo Park. BB and CeCe Winans were regulars on the Baker's TV show Praise the Lord, and he developed a friendship with them at this time. He says Jim Baker was actually an early mentor to him and taught him what it meant to live a life that was fully committed to God. During these performances at Buffalo Park, John would vacillate seamlessly between singing and exhorting or preaching, and people were starting to take notice.
Come on, God's grace, God's love, God's deliverance, before it even happens, rest on your life.
He was beginning to feel the pull to do more with his music, so he approached a local church called Jerusalem House of God in Charlotte, North Carolina, about letting him use their building on Thursday nights to have choir rehearsal.
But it would be packed with people from all over Carolina. I'm getting a little notoriety. John P. Key is doing his service.
So these choir rehearsal events were starting to be kind of a big deal. People were showing up just to watch John's group rehearse.
People just start coming in our rehearsal. Off the street corner, young people. At one time, I was going to tell them to stop because we don't get a chance to really practice or rehearse like I think we should. But they enjoy it so much, and so I said, thank you, Lord.
But it wasn't just choir rehearsal. They were doing street ministry afterwards, too. In fact, he always thought of the group that he had assembled as more of a street ministry team than anything. They would buy Bojangles chicken and give it away to folks who were living on the streets. They prayed with people and helped them to get cleaned up if they were ready. Many of the people that they ministered to ended up joining his choir, which he named the New Life Community Choir. As a result, a lot of the singers that he used weren't really singers at all. A lot of them were people that he had known when he was on the streets, that he trained to sing. He figured if he could teach himself to imitate people like Rance Allen and Stevie Wonder, he could teach them too. He never took offerings at these rehearsals, and he would often use those nights to try out new music that he was working on, and then he would turn around and sell those songs to other artists. During this time, he was also writing some of the songs that he would become known for. Wash Me, Wait on Him, and a song called Jesus is Real, which he initially wrote with what he called a New York feel, just right for a burgeoning choir director out of New York looking for new material, a guy named Hezekiah Walker. But when John P. Key realized how good the song was, he knew he wanted to record it and release it himself, so he had to take it back. He was also tapped to write a few commercial jingles at this time.
So I'm giving you this Hallmark, and I hope that you will see what I'm really giving you is a part of me.
John P. Key had put out a couple of albums in the late 80s that didn't quite bring him national acclaim, but his 1991 album, Wash Me, was his breakout project. Turns out that his instinct to save Jesus is Real for one of his own projects was spot on. Every choir everywhere was singing Jesus is Real, and it wasn't just the song that brought him attention. John P. Key was someone who consistently filmed his live concerts. His choir was as much a visual experience as it was a listening experience. Though he frequently performed with the full New Life Community Choir, he would often be seen with a smaller, more agile group that he called the New Life Singers, or simply New Life. This configuration worked better for tour dates and television appearances. If you pay close attention to the singers in black at Carlton Pearson's Azusa conference, you'll see what I mean. Just ignore the jewel-toned choir behind them. That wasn't his group. Although, if you look closely, you'll actually see me in that choir. Over there. Anyway, the Singers in Black, that's new life, just a small ensemble of 15 to 20 singers. There was something energetically different about this choir. They were young, they practically danced when they sang, they didn't wear robes, and you would often see them in funky matching outfits doing coordinated dances to Gap Band or Stevie Wonder grooves. They were different than the mass choirs that had dominated the previous 2 decades. It didn't feel like their very existence was necessarily tethered to church. They were bringing that street vibe to the church while at the same time bringing the church to the streets. This lighter, mid-sized ensemble harkened back to a time when the sound of gospel music underwent a similar shift a generation before. Edwin Hawkins burst onto the scene with his mid-sized ensemble, the Edwin Hawkins Singers, in the late 60s, and changed not only what gospel sounded like, but what it looked like. These weren't swaying saints on risers and robes. Suddenly, gospel music was youthful, it was modern, and Walter Hawkins and Andre Crouch took that sound into the 70s by combining funk and soul grooves with messages of evangelism and soul winning. Leaders like Richard Smallwood and Bobby Jones took this ensemble concept into the 80s, but they adhered to a much more traditional sound. The 90s, however, brought a full-on sound revolution led by John P. Key that brought a youthful invigoration back to contemporary gospel that has dominated the genre ever since. Groups like Ty Tribbett and Kirk Franklin and the Family owe a huge debt to John P. Key. Kirk Franklin owes a huge debt to John P. Key. It's impossible not to see John P. Key's influence on Fred Hammond and Radical for Christ, and for that matter, Kanye's Sunday Service Choir, directed by Jason White. In the wake of John P. Key's success, even large-scale choirs like Hezekiah Walker and the Love Fellowship Crusade Choir, Ricky Dillard and New G and Orlando Draper and the Associates were all presenting charismatic, energetic, contemporary concepts and pushing the boundaries of what modern gospel choirs could do. It's no coincidence that films like Sister Act 2, The Preacher's Wife, and The Fighting Temptations were huge successes in the 90s and early 2000s. Choirs were hot, and John P. Key had a lot to do with ushering in that phenomenon. I recently watched a documentary on the history of gospel music that barely mentioned John P. Key, and that's a shame, because those of us who were there remember what he meant to the music, and those of us who have followed him throughout his career know what a generous spirit he still is. Like the greats that preceded him, he probably wouldn't put up a stink about his accomplishments being minimized, but those of us who know the truth, we will put up a stink. We do not take his influence for granted, and we will not allow the name of Pastor John P. Key to be forgotten.